Hello, History 363. So today we're going to try to get to the end of the Second Punic War. And we left off with the initiative really shifting permanently to the Romans when the last kind of major Carthaginian offensive, the attempt of Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, who, after suffering a defeat against Scipio in Spain, tries to bring his army into Italy to join up with Hannibal. And this might really actually reboot the Carthaginian war effort. If Hannibal can get the reinforcements he needs to, again, try to force a confrontation with Roman armies in Italy. As it is, Hasdrubal Barca is intercepted at the Battle of the Metaurus River in 207 and killed. And that's really the last time that the Carthaginians are going to be able to go on the offensive. Now, Hannibal's still in Italy. He still has a modest army, although probably reduced due to just wastage. And there is a sort of ring of Roman armies around him, engaging in a kind of state of Fabian containment, not willing to risk a confrontation, but really limiting Hannibal's freedom of action. Therefore, the main Roman initiative remains in Spain, where young Publius Cornelius Scipio, the future Africanus, continues his rampage. So he's taken New Carthage, the Carthaginian, for want of a better word, capital in Spain, main military base in Spain. He subsequently defeats Hasdrubal Barca on the upper Baecula River at the Battle of Baecula in 208, which we talked about last time. And now he confronts the last major Carthaginian army in Spain, moving into the lower Baecula River valley. And notice how far he's actually is operating now from where he started out, way up on the Ebro River. Now he's really confronting the last major Carthaginian force in Spain. This is commanded by another guy named Hasdrubal, this time Hasdrubal Gesgo. I told you there were going to be a lot of Hasdrubals. And so Scipio finally confronts and defeats Hasdrubal Gesgo at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC. And this battle involves even more complex tactics that again shows Scipio to, probably be a military genius in his own right, but also show how much he's learned from the Carthaginians, in particular the Carthaginian practice of envelopment. Now at this point, Scipio has an army that is about half Roman and Italian, and the other half are Iberian peoples, many of whom had previously been fighting for Carthage and have either switched sides or been forced to switch sides to fight with the Romans. And Scipio seems to think that these troops are of somewhat inferior quality, and also, and that may just be chauvinism, but also seems to think that the Carthaginians consider these troops to be of inferior cavalry. And so before the battle, both Hasdrubal Gesgo and Scipio sort of line up their armies on multiple days. And this is actually not uncommon in the ancient world, of both sides sort of prepping for battle, lining up for battle, and then deciding that the terms aren't favorable enough. And so they line up, and Scipio doesn't attack. They line up the next day, Scipio doesn't attack. Now, when Scipio is lining up, he puts his Romans and Italians in the center, frequently a place in the ancient world where commanders put their best troops. And then he puts his Iberian auxiliaries on the wings, and he does this day after day after day. And Hasdrubal Gesgo responds by putting his best troops in the center and putting his weaker troops on the wings. On the last day, Scipio switches it up. This time he puts his Iberian troops in the center as a fixing force. In military terminology, to fix an enemy is to confront them but not actually come to blows with them. But because your troops are there, they lose their freedom of maneuver. So the Iberians are now used as a fixing force in the center. And now Scipio puts his Romans and Italians on the wings, which means his best troops are now attacking against the worst troops of the Carthaginians, while Scipio's worst troops fix the best Carthaginian troops. His Roman and Italian troops on the wings then execute a really intricate maneuver, which essentially they move from a line to a column and then they wheel around back into a line in a grand kind of flanking maneuver. And this rolls up both of the Carthaginian flanks and causes the Carthaginian army to collapse with heavy casualties. Now, Hasdrubal survives. He goes back to North Africa, where he becomes the commander-in-chief of Carthaginian defenses in North Africa. But this is the end of Carthaginian power in Spain. From 206 BC onward, Spain is effectively, it falls under Rome's hegemony, even though it's not yet necessarily, not everybody in Spain thinks they're part of the Roman Empire. Indeed, there's a lot of Iberian peoples who were happy to collaborate with the Romans to boot the Carthaginians out, but all of a sudden find themselves unhappy now that the Romans make it clear that they're going to stay. Because after Scipio leaves, he goes back to run for consul. The Romans elect two new extraordinary commanders who will hold imperium, proconsular imperium in Spain. Again, the Romans make it clear that between the manpower and the mineral resources, they intend to stay. Now, Scipio Africanus himself goes back at the end of 206. He plans to run for consul in 205, and after his splendid victories, he is easily elected. That said, there is a bit of a snub. He wants to hold a triumphal parade, a great Roman victory parade, where the victorious army enters the city, driving captives ahead of it. The army and the general in his chariot, followed by the loot that they have taken. And the triumph is really one of the greatest honors that a successful Roman general can receive. Even during the intensive warfare of the mid-Republic, maybe only about a third of the consuls are actually privileged with a triumph. Less in moments of less intensive warfare, of course. So Scipio receives petitions for a triumph, and the Senate says no. And it seems their justification is a triumph is only for people who are magistrates or pro-magistrates, but Scipio, because of this kind of a regular position he holds, because of the fact that he's never been praetor or consul, can't have a triumph. That also may be a bit of a snub against Scipio, who at this point is like 30 years old, and while he's proven his military genius, nonetheless may be seen by the Senate as someone who's a little too big for his britches. Indeed, Scipio seems to come into conflict now with both a faction around Fabius Maximus, because Scipio, as consul, wants Africa as his province. He wants to finally take the war home to the Carthaginians. Fabius Maximus, however, again, who is toward, at the end of his career, at the end of his life, actually, wants to continue this kind of Fabian strategy, essentially arguing that to try a confrontation would be foolhardy. And of course, we ourselves have just learned what happened to the last Roman army that invaded Africa. It was annihilated, and the Carthaginians captured the consul and tortured him to death. A disastrous event. And now Scipio says, I've got a good idea. Why don't me, the consul, take an army and go to North Africa? Now, Fabius's objections are not strong enough to win the day, although some constraints are put on Scipio. He is not allowed to levy fresh troops. He instead takes sort of volunteers, probably many former veterans from Spain. He is given legions in Sicily that he can then reinforce with these volunteers, but he's not allowed to hold a fresh levy to raise new soldiers. He also is given Sicily as his province, with the sort of rider that if he so chooses, he can subsequently invade Africa. So Scipio goes to Africa. He eventually gets command of the 2 legions who had served at Cannae. All of these men who had survived Cannae are sent to Sicily as kind of punishment and are forced to soldier in Sicily until the last Carthaginian troops leave Italy. And now Scipio says, well, guess what? You guys, he discharges the oldest of them, he pluses them up with his volunteers, and he says, okay, we're going to North Africa. So in 204 BC, Scipio now invades North Africa, and here he engages in a really kind of complex bit of diplomacy. He's actually been engaged in this diplomacy since when he was even still in Spain, and that is diplomacy with the Numidians. That is, Scipio has a relatively small army when he hits ground in North Africa. He only has about maybe 16,000 men. He doesn't have enough troops to actually force a confrontation with Carthage. And so therefore he needs additional manpower. And the manpower that he is looking for is the Numidians. Again, people who live on the fringes of the broader Carthaginian Empire, that is the fringes of the Libyans who are directly ruled by Carthage. And then the Numidians are the people who live beyond that. Now the Numidians, different Numidian factions have had long relationships with Carthage. This is actually not uncommon that sort of big empires like the Roman Empire eventually, or the Chinese Chinese Empire, will have sort of areas under their direct control, but then they'll use relationships, diplomacy, networks to sort of use barbarian peoples, for want of a better word, to kind of help them control the periphery. And the Carthaginians do that with the Numidians. There's actually been a bit of a flip. During much of the war, there is a Numidian king named Sufax who is hostile to the Carthaginians. And therefore the Carthaginians sort of are allied with the opposite faction, a chieftain named Gela. But Gela dies, and this leads to a succession crisis in which one of his cadet sons, Massinissa, takes a very kind of he has a vague claim to the leadership of this Numidian faction, but he kind of seems to realize that his vague claim may be stronger if the Romans support it. And so there's actually a bit of a flip in that Sufax is eventually reconciled with the Carthaginians. So Sufax marries his daughter to Hasdrubal Barca, so now we have Carthage and Sufax are allies, and Massinissa, despite the fact that his sort of broader faction had previously been friendly to Rome, throws his weight in with the Romans. Scipio, Massinissa has troops, particularly cavalry, that pluses up the Roman forces. That being said, initially Massinissa doesn't have that many guys because Massinissa's claim isn't that strong. So the first battle that's fought in North Africa is actually not a set-piece battle. Rather, Scipio hears that the Carthaginian army has united with a large Numidian army under the command of Sufax, and that they are occupying a large, poorly sort of constructed camp where most of the huts and the buildings and even the walls are all wood. And so Scipio launches a raid against this camp at nighttime, moving through the desert, and essentially his soldiers are just engaged in this incendiary raid. They throw firebrands into the camp, they set it on fire, and they slaughter people who are coming out, and the survivors stream off into the desert, not as an army, but as a disorganized force. And so this is a huge coup, because previously Scipio and the forces that Massinissa could bring weren't really enough to confront the Carthaginian army. But now the Carthaginian army's half of it's been burnt alive. And so now Scipio is actually ready to commit to a set-piece battle. And a set-piece battle follows shortly. Hasdrubal Barca and Sufax rally what troops they can. They hire mercenaries, including mercenaries from Celtiberian areas in Spain. That is, there are people who are unhappy with this current Roman situation, the Romans clearly moving into Spain, and are still willing to serve Carthage. Some of these may actually be old allies, loyal subject of Carthage. The Carthaginians are gone, but they say, hey, we're still willing to fight for Carthage. So with this army that Sufax and Hasdrubal Barca have cobbled together, they confront Scipio basically in a big field, the Battle of the Campus Magnus, or Campi Magni, the Battle of the Big Field. Here again, Scipio succeeds in an envelopment smashing up the Numidians on the flanks and actually surrounding and annihilating that Celtiberian mercenary brigade that actually fights to the end. So a second devastating battle in which the Carthaginian army in Africa is effectively annihilated. With this, the Carthaginians sue for peace. And so there are peace negotiations that take place. With this, Scipio and his army are now sitting in Africa, kind of waiting for the diplomatic process to grind forward, not just the negotiations, the approval, the treaty needs to be approved by the Roman people. One of the obvious requirements is that Hannibal will leave Italy, and Hannibal indeed loads up his troops and disembarks and lands his army at Hadrumetum, to the south of Carthage. And this simple fact seems to actually kind of radically change Carthaginian calculations. Before they were ready to surrender because there were no more armies in Carthage, and Scipio therefore was in a position to directly threaten the city after the Battle of the Campus Magnus. But now Hannibal is back, and I should note, in between the Battle of Campus Magnus and the return of Hannibal, one thing that Scipio does is he actually lends troops to Massinissa, and these Roman soldiers help Massinissa conquer the entirety of conquer Numidia. Sufax is defeated and captured, and so it's Massinissa, who's been a sort of loyal auxiliary, is rewarded by being given this huge kingdom west of Carthage that is generated by is sponsored by Roman power. So that's actually one event that's happening. Indeed, Massinissa is sort of off, still chasing down his various enemies as this peace process is supposedly going forward. But when Hannibal gets back, Carthage breaks off negotiations. They decide that with Hannibal in Africa, they've got a sufficiently good army under the greatest captain in antiquity, and they're going to see if they can fight for at least better terms. I mean, obviously they've already lost a lot, right? They've already lost Spain, but it's not possible that if they are able to chase Scipio out of Africa or simply make his position so uncomfortable that he says, okay, look, we're not going to make you pay an indemnity, or we're not going to demand that you give up your navy, things like that, things of that nature, or terms that they already find jarring. So there actually seems to be possibly a significant amount of time. Publius makes it seem like within days or weeks there's the fight, but we sort of get the sense that it actually may be about 8 months before Scipio and Hannibal confront each other. Hannibal has to train a new army, where the Carthaginians are busy hiring mercenaries. They're training up citizen troops. Scipio himself is actually trying to head, as soon as the hostilities are reignited, he heads off into Libya trying to link up with Massinissa, who's off in Numidia kind of doing his own thing. So it seems that it's really not until October, the truce is broken probably in February 202. It's not really until around October that they actually confront each other. At this point, Massinissa rejoins Scipio with a large force of infantry and cavalry, and Hannibal finally moves from Hadrumetum with a large army, 50,000 men strong. And this leads to the last great battle of the Second Punic War, the Battle of Zama. And here, Hannibal seems to kind of mimic Roman tactics. That is, he arrays his troops in 3 lines, a triplex acies, mercenaries in the front, a second line of Carthaginian citizens and Libyan conscripts, and to the third line, which is positioned somewhat to the rear, are his veterans from Italy, the soldiers who may have been serving with him since 218, and so are the most experienced grizzled troops. And it seems that Hannibal's plan is sort of the mercenaries will sort of be kind of cannon fodder, as maybe even are the Carthaginian citizens. And he may even have, it does seem that the third line is somewhat longer, so he may actually have it in kind of some kind of pincer formation, kind of a trap for that Scipio, he hopes, will blunder into, fighting the mercenaries, fighting the Carthaginian conscripts, and then kind of like Paulus and Varro at Cannae, charging forward only to face this third line, probably somewhat extended, of veterans, of the best soldiers in the Carthaginian army. Scipio, now there's one other asset that Hannibal has that he actually had he hasn't really had in Italy, because they all died crossing the Alps, or most of them died crossing the Alps, and that's elephants. He has over 80 war elephants. And therefore Scipio adjusts his battle plan. He still has the triplex acies, but he arrays his maniples in columns rather than the standard Roman practice of sort of putting maniples in a little checkerboard formation where the maniples sort of cover the gaps in between. The maniple to the rear covers the gaps to the two maniples in the front. So this creates channels that the elephants can be driven through and then ideally dealt with. As it is, the elephant charge doesn't have much effect. The elephants either are diverted through the channels, or many of them seem to panic, run to the flanks, and maybe even disrupt the Carthaginian cavalry. The infantry lines clash. The Romans drive the mercenaries back. At one point, they may even drive the mercenaries into the line of the Carthaginian and Libyan conscripts, causing even more chaos. So the Romans, having dispatched the first two lines, now confront Hannibal's final line, which seems to be longer because Scipio is compelled to actually extend his own lines. He brings up his Principes and his Triarii, the rear lines of the Roman army, and actually posts them to the flanks, so himself creating a long, extended line. Then there is fierce fighting, although it ends when the Roman and Italian cavalry, along with Massinissa's Numidian cavalry, chases off the Carthaginian cavalry and then comes and envelops Hannibal from the rear, kind of reverse Cannae. Hannibal, realizing the trap is about to shut, flees back to Carthage to rally the handful of survivors, but we're told that 20,000 Carthaginian soldiers are killed, another 20,000 are captured. Scipio now moves back towards Carthage, although maybe at a bit of a loss. He probably doesn't have the ability to besiege Carthage, and he's worried that he might be replaced by another commander the next year. After all, at this point, he's been a proconsul in Spain, his command extended oftentimes by the Roman people, despite the fact his political enemies would like to take over that command and have the glory of finishing off the war. So it's probably to Scipio's relief when Hannibal himself urges the Carthaginians to surrender. Indeed, we're told that there's a kind of hard-line Carthaginian senator who's up there arguing, no, we need to fight on, we'll fight them to the death. And Hannibal, who at this point realizes the war is over, pushes this guy off the speaker's platform and says, it's over, we have to surrender. So in some ways, Hannibal, as the most prestigious Carthaginian commander, is the one who finally convinces the city to give up. The terms that Scipio imposes are harsh, but Carthage continues to exist as a city. It continues to control an empire in Libya. It is, however, forbidden from having war elephants. It's forbidden from having a fleet beyond a small coast guard. It's forbidden from making offensive war, and it can only make defensive war with the permission of Rome. It also now has to pay another huge indemnity, this time 200 talents a year for 50 years. So an indemnity of 10,000 talents. Remember, a talent is about 70 pounds of silver. And so this is going to now be flowing into the Roman treasury. So this really ends Carthage as a great Mediterranean power in a way that the First Punic War hadn't. There is going to be no recovery or no return to hegemony as there had been after the First Punic War, particularly due to the policies of Hasdrubal Barca. So thus ends the Second Punic War. Scipio Africanus returns to Rome and has a triumph. Even though this is a triumph at tremendous cost. The Romans have lost a huge number of citizen soldiers. Italian peoples have suffered markedly. And just to give you an idea of the losses, again, in 225, when the Gauls are coming, the Romans do probably a kind of emergency census, and they discover there are 325,000 adult male Roman citizens capable of serving. When the Romans do a very thorough census in 203 BC, there are 214,000 adult male Roman citizens. Now, a few of those not registered are the companions who have rebelled and have therefore been kind of punished by not being citizens anymore. But still, largely the disparity between those two numbers, 325 and 214, gives you a sense of the immense human cost on the Roman side of the Second Punic War, even as Rome is now positioned to be the dominant power in the West. And as we'll see next lecture, almost immediately after the fighting stops, the Romans start looking to the east. And so next time we'll talk about the Second Macedonian War that begins in 200 BC, even as Rome is still smarting from the injuries of this long and devastating war. So we'll talk then.